The blood soaking through her stockings had turned from bright red to a dark, sickening brown. But Delilah Sterling did not stop moving her feet because the alternative was far worse than the pain. The year was 1882, and Desdemona. Texas was a town carved out of dust and desperation, where the Brazos River ran low and the saloons ran high with whiskey and wickedness. The Silver Spur Saloon stood at the corner of Main Street and Prosperity Avenue, though there was precious little prosperity to be found within its smoke-stained walls. Delilah had been dancing for 6 hours straight, ever since the sun set behind the western hills and painted the sky the color of dried blood. Her employer, a thick-necked man named Victor Malone, who owned the saloon and half the desperate souls in it, had made it clear that she would dance until the last patron left or until she collapsed, whichever came first. She was 20 years old and had been working at the Silver Spur for 3 months, ever since her father died of consumption and left her with nothing but debts that somehow became her responsibility. Malone had offered her a way to pay them off, a way that seemed reasonable at first until she realized the terms were designed to keep her trapped forever. Every meal she ate, every torn stocking she replaced, every moment she rested was added to her debt with interest that multiplied like locusts. The fiddle player in the corner had stopped looking at her 2 hours ago, his eyes fixed on his instrument as though he could not bear to witness what was happening. The piano player kept his rhythm mechanical and steady, and the other girls had long since finished their shifts and disappeared upstairs or out the back door. But Delilah kept dancing, her feet screaming with every step, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her smile fixed in place like a death mask because Malone was watching from his table near the bar, his cold eyes tracking her every movement. The men in the saloon were drunk and rowdy, their laughter harsh and their comments cruder as the night wore on. They threw coins at her feet, and she was expected to pick them up between dance steps, bending and swaying in ways that made her skin crawl. Her dress, a faded red thing with tattered lace, and a hem that showed her ankles, clung to her body with sweat. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in damp tendrils around her face. When she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the makeshift stage, Malone stood up. The movement was enough to freeze the blood in her veins. She forced herself upright, forced her feet to move again, even though she could feel the warm wetness of blood squelching inside her worn dancing shoes. The pain had gone beyond sharp agony into something almost transcendent, a white-hot suffering that made the edges of her vision blur and sparkle. That was when the door opened and a man walked in who did not belong to the usual crowd of drifters and ranch hands. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to fill the doorway and a presence that seemed to change the very air in the room. His hat was pulled low, casting shadows across a face that was all hard angles and weathered planes tanned from years under the Texas sun. His clothes were dusty from travel, his boots worn but well-made, and there were twin revolvers strapped to his hips in holsters that showed the kind of wear that came from regular use. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of and had nothing to prove to anyone. Delilah noticed him because everyone noticed him. The conversations in the saloon did not stop exactly, but they shifted, became more cautious. Even Malone settled back in his chair, his expression calculating as he watched the stranger approach the bar. The newcomer ordered whiskey in a voice that was low and rough, like gravel under wagon wheels. The bartender poured with hands that were steadier than they had been all night. The stranger took his glass and turned, leaning back against the bar as his eyes swept the room with the methodical assessment of a man who had learned to evaluate threats and exits in the same glance. Those eyes, a startling shade of blue-gray like storm clouds over the plains, landed on Delilah and stopped. She felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing, and for a moment she forgot to keep dancing. Her feet faltered, her body swayed, and Malone was on his feet again, his chair scraping back with a harsh sound that cut through the music. "Keep dancing, girl," Malone barked, his voice carrying across the room. "You have got 2 more hours on your debt clock." Delilah forced herself to move again, but she could feel the stranger's eyes still on her, and there was something in his expression that she could not quite read. Not the leering interest of the other men, not the cold calculation of Malone, but something else entirely. Something that looked almost like recognition, though they had never met before. The music continued. Her feet bled. The stranger drank his whiskey slowly and did not look away. Another 15 minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Delilah's vision was starting to narrow. Dark spots swimming at the edges like flies buzzing around spoiled meat. She knew she was close to collapse, and she knew that if she fell, Malone would add a penalty to her debt that would keep her dancing for another month at least. The thought was almost enough to make her want to fall anyway, to surrender to the darkness that was creeping in from all sides, but something stubborn in her core kept her upright, kept her moving. She stumbled again, harder this time, and her knee hit the stage floor with a crack that sent a new wave of pain shooting up her leg. She tried to push herself up, but her arms were shaking too badly, and the room was spinning like a whirlwind. "Get up," Malone growled, starting toward the stage. "Get up, or I will add another week to your time." Delilah's hand slipped in the blood that had pooled on the stage floor from her ruined feet. She could not get up. Her body simply would not obey anymore. Malone reached the stage and grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. He hauled her roughly to her feet, and she cried out in pain as her weight came down on her destroyed feet. The room was spinning faster now, and she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like distant drums. "I said dance," Malone said, giving her a shake that rattled her teeth. "Let her go." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the saloon like a knife through silk. Everyone turned to look at the stranger, who had set down his whiskey glass and moved away from the bar. He was not touching his guns, but his hands hung loose at his sides in a way that suggested he could reach them faster than most men could blink. Malone's grip on Delilah's arm tightened. "This is none of your concern, stranger. The girl has a debt to work off." "I do not care about her debt," the stranger said, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge now that made the hair on the back of Delilah's neck stand up. "I care that you are about to kill her to collect it. Let her go." "Who the hell are you to walk into my establishment and tell me what to do?" Malone demanded. But Delilah could hear the uncertainty in his voice. This was a man who ruled through fear and intimidation, but he had just met someone who was not afraid. The stranger took another step forward. "My name is Brooks Patterson. I am a federal marshal out of Austin, and I'm telling you one last time to let the girl go." The room went dead silent. Even the piano player stopped, his hands frozen over the keys. Federal marshals were rare in these parts, and they carried authority that superseded local law. More importantly, they carried reputations, and Delilah saw the flicker of recognition in Malone's eyes that said he had heard of Brooks Patterson. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Malone released Delilah's arm with a shove that sent her stumbling backward. She would have fallen if Brooks had not been there suddenly, moving faster than seemed possible for a man his size, catching her before she hit the ground. His arms were solid and steady, and for the first time in hours, Delilah felt safe. She looked up into his face, into those storm cloud eyes, and saw something there that made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. "Can you walk?" he asked her quietly. She tried to nod, tried to say yes, but her body chose that moment to give up entirely. Her vision went black around the edges, then black everywhere, and she felt herself falling into darkness that was almost welcoming after the bright pain of the saloon. The last thing she was aware of was being lifted, held against a chest that was warm and solid, and carried toward the door. She heard Malone shouting something about theft and debts, heard Brooks's voice cutting through it like a whip crack, saying words she could not quite make out. Then the cool night air hit her face, and she knew nothing else. When Delilah woke, the first thing she noticed was that she was not in pain. The realization was so unexpected that it took her a moment to process. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against soft lamplight, and found herself in a room she did not recognize. It was clean, which was the first clue that she was not in the boarding house where she rented a corner of a room with 3 other girls. The bed beneath her was narrow but had a real mattress, not just a straw tick, and the blanket covering her was wool, worn but whole. She tried to sit up and immediately discovered that while her feet were not in active agony, they were bandaged and still very much injured. The movement made her wince, and immediately there was the sound of a chair scraping and boots on wooden floorboards. Brooks Patterson appeared in her line of sight, and in the lamplight she could see him more clearly than she had in the saloon. He was probably close to 30, with dark brown hair that was a bit too long and a face that would have been handsome if it were not so severe. There was a thin scar cutting through his left eyebrow and another along his jaw, the kind of marks that came from a hard life lived dangerously. But his eyes, those striking blue-gray eyes, were gentle as they looked at her. "Easy," he said, his voice still carrying that rough quality but softer now. "You should not be moving yet. You have been unconscious for nearly 4 hours." Delilah looked around the room more carefully. It was small and sparse, with just the bed, a chair, a washstand, and a table with a lamp. Through the single window she could see that it was still dark outside, though whether it was the same night or another she could not tell. "Where am I?" she asked, and her voice came out hoarse and cracked. "Doctor's office," Brooks said, "such as it is. Desdemona does not have a proper doctor, just an old army surgeon named Henderson who drinks too much but knows his way around wounds. He cleaned and bandaged your feet. Said you are lucky you did not get infection." Delilah looked down at her bandaged feet, at the clean white cotton wrapped carefully around them. She could not remember the last time anyone had taken care of her. The realization made her throat tight. "Why?" she whispered. Brooks pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down, leaning forward with his forearms resting on his knees. "Why did I carry you out of that hellhole?" She nodded. He was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Because what Malone was doing to you was not legal employment. It was slavery dressed up in pretty words and false debts. I've been tracking him for 3 weeks now, following reports of young women who ended up working for him and never working free. You are the 7th girl I have found who got trapped in his system." "But you are a federal marshal," Delilah said, confused. "Why would you be investigating a saloon owner?" "Because Malone is more than just a saloon owner. He is part of a larger operation that traffics women across state lines, moving them from one establishment to another, always keeping them in debt, always keeping them working. It is illegal under federal law, which makes it my jurisdiction." Delilah absorbed this information slowly. She had known that something about her arrangement with Malone was wrong, had felt it in her bones. But she had been so desperate after her father's death that she had not seen any other option. And once she started working, once the debt began to grow instead of shrink, she had felt trapped in a way that was worse than any physical chains. "What happens now?" she asked. Brooks's expression hardened. "Now I go back to the Silver Spur and arrest Malone and anyone working with him. I have enough evidence to shut down his operation in Desdemona and connect him to the larger trafficking ring. He will stand trial in Austin." "He will not go quietly," Delilah said, fear creeping into her voice. "He has men who work for him, enforcers. They do terrible things to people who cross him." "I know," Brooks said simply. "I have dealt with men like him before." There was something in the way he said it, a quiet confidence born from experience, that made Delilah believe him. She studied his face in the lamplight, taking in the scars and the weathered skin and the eyes that had seen too much violence, but still held a core of something decent. He was a hard man, but not a cruel one. She could sense the difference. "What about me?" she asked quietly. "What happens to me?" Brooks's expression softened slightly. "Your debt to Malone is void. What he did was illegal, which means any contract you signed is not enforceable. You are free to go wherever you want." Free? The word sounded foreign, like something from another language. Delilah tried to imagine what that meant, where she would go, what she would do. She had no money, no family, no prospects. Her father had been a ranch hand before the consumption took him, and she had learned no trade except the kind of dancing that left her feet bleeding. Brooks must have seen something in her face because he added, "Henderson said you need to stay off your feet for at least 2 weeks to let them heal properly. You can stay here during that time. I have already paid him for the room and for your care." "Why would you do that?" Delilah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." Brooks was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. When he spoke, his voice was honest, in a way that made her chest tighten again. "Because someone should have helped you sooner. Because what happened to you was not right. And I am tired of seeing women treated like property in a country that claims to be civilized. And because when I walked into that saloon and saw you dancing with blood on the floor, something in me could not walk away." The intensity in his gaze made Delilah's breath catch. There was something there, something she could not quite name but could feel nonetheless. It was not pity, which she would have resented, but something deeper and more complicated. Before she could respond, there was a knock on the door. Brooks stood immediately, his hand going to the revolver at his hip in a movement so smooth it was clearly instinctive. "Who is it?" "Henderson," came a gravelly voice from the other side, "and's got some broth for the girl if she's awake." Brooks relaxed slightly and opened the door. The doctor who entered was exactly as described. Old, with a face like worn leather and hands that trembled slightly but moved with remembered precision. He carried a bowl of something that smelled surprisingly good, and he nodded to Delilah with professional concern. "You are awake," he observed. "Good. You need to drink this and then sleep more. Your body has been through hell, and it needs time to recover." Delilah accepted the bowl and found that she was ravenously hungry. The broth was simple, just chicken and vegetables, but it tasted better than anything she could remember eating. Henderson watched her with approval, then turned to Brooks. "You planning on going after Malone tonight?" he asked bluntly. Brooks nodded. "Soon as I'm sure she's settled." Henderson grunted. "You will need backup. Malone has at least 6 men in that saloon who will not hesitate to shoot a federal marshal." "I have handled worse odds," Brooks said calmly. "That is what my last patient said before they brought him to me with 3 bullets in his chest," Henderson replied dryly. "Pride gets you killed in this business, son." Brooks's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. Delilah finished her broth and handed the bowl back to Henderson, then looked at Brooks with concern she had no right to feel for a man she had just met. "He is right," she said. "You should not go alone. Malone has a man named Dutch who is fast with a gun, and another one called Silas who likes knives. And there are others, men who drift through and work for him when he needs extra muscle." Brooks looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "You know his operation well." "I worked there for 3 months, Delilah said. "I kept my eyes open and my mouth shut. It is how you survive in a place like that." Henderson nodded approvingly. "Smart girl. You should listen to her, Patterson. Go get the sheriff. I know Sheriff Colton is not the bravest man in Texas, but he is honest enough, and he has 2 deputies who can shoot straight." Brooks looked like he wanted to argue, but then his eyes met Delilah's and something passed between them. Some unspoken communication that made him nod slowly. "All right. I will get the sheriff, but I am going tonight. The longer I wait, the more chance Malone has to run or to hurt someone else." He turned to Delilah and his expression softened again. "You stay here and rest. Lock the door after I leave, and do not open it for anyone except Henderson or me, understand?" Delilah nodded, though the thought of him walking into danger made her stomach twist with anxiety. She barely knew this man, this federal marshal who had appeared out of nowhere and carried her away from hell, but already she felt connected to him in a way that defied logic. Brooks hesitated, as if he wanted to say something else, but then he just nodded and turned toward the door. Henderson followed him out, and Delilah heard their voices in the hallway discussing plans and contingencies. Then the door closed, and she was alone. She lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Everything had changed so quickly. Just hours ago she had been dancing until her feet bled, trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. Now she was free, cared for, and protected by a man who seemed to have stepped out of some kind of story. It felt too good to be true, and she had learned long ago that things that seemed too good to be true usually were. But when she closed her eyes, all she could see was Brooks's face, those storm cloud eyes looking at her with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time in years. She fell asleep thinking about him, worrying about him, hoping he would come back safe. Brooks Patterson stood in the shadows across from the Silver Spur saloon and watched the building with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that rushing into danger was a good way to end up dead. Beside him stood Sheriff Colton, a middle-aged man with a graying mustache and nervous energy that manifested in constant movement. The two deputies, young men named Tucker and James, flanked them with rifles held ready. "How do you want to do this?" Colton asked quietly. Brooks had already scoped out the building, noting the exits and windows, the positions where Malone's men would likely be stationed. "I go in the front and announce the arrest. You and your men cover the back and side exits. Anyone who runs, you stop them. Anyone who shoots, you shoot back." Colton nodded, though Brooks could see the fear in his eyes. Small-town sheriffs were used to breaking up bar fights and tracking down stolen horses, not raiding criminal operations. But to his credit, Colton did not back down. "Give us 5 minutes to get in position," Colton said, then melted into the shadows with his deputies. Brooks waited, counting off the seconds in his head while he ran through scenarios and outcomes. He had done this kind of thing more times than he could count over his 8 years as a marshal, but it never got easier. There was always the possibility that tonight would be the night his luck ran out, that he would take a bullet in the wrong place and end up in a grave outside some dusty town whose name he could barely remember. But when he thought about Delilah, about the look in her eyes when she realized she was free, about the way she had felt in his arms when he carried her out of the saloon, something in his chest tightened with a feeling he had not experienced in years. It was not just duty driving him now. It was something more personal, more dangerous in its own way. 5 minutes passed. Brooks checked his revolvers one last time, then stepped out of the shadows and walked across the street with purposeful strides. The saloon was still open, though it was late enough that the crowd had thinned considerably. Through the windows, he could see maybe a dozen patrons, and he spotted at least 3 of Malone's men positioned around the room. He pushed through the doors, and every eye in the place turned toward him. The piano player stopped mid-song, his hands hovering over the keys. Malone was still at his table near the bar, and the expression on his face shifted from surprise to anger in the space of a heartbeat. "You have got some nerve coming back here," Malone growled, rising to his feet. Brooks pulled back his coat to show the marshal's badge pinned to his vest. "Victor Malone, I am placing you under arrest for human trafficking, forced labor, and violation of federal statutes regarding the transport of women across state lines for immoral purposes. You have the right to surrender peacefully or to resist and face the consequences." The room erupted in chaos. Malone's men went for their guns, but Brooks was faster. His revolvers cleared leather in a blur of motion, and he fired twice before anyone else got off a shot. The first bullet hit Dutch in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun clattering across the floor. The second took down Silas, who had been reaching for a knife, with a shot to the leg that dropped him howling to the ground. The other patrons scrambled for cover, diving under tables or rushing toward the doors. Brooks moved with the fluid grace of long experience, putting his back to a support post as he tracked the remaining threats. One of Malone's men fired from behind the bar, the bullet splintering wood inches from Brooks's head. Brooks returned fire, his shot smashing the mirror behind the bar and sending the shooter ducking for cover. Then the back door burst open and Sheriff Colton and his deputies came in with rifles raised. "Drop your weapons," Colton shouted, his voice cracking slightly but his aim steady. The fight went out of Malone's men all at once. They could face one marshal, but not 4 lawmen with the drop on them. Guns clattered to the floor one by one. Malone himself stood frozen by his table, his face contorted with rage, and something that might have been fear. "This is not over," Malone said through gritted teeth as Brooks approached him with handcuffs. "You do not know who you are dealing with, Marshal. I have friends. Powerful friends, you will regret this." Brooks grabbed Malone's arm and wrenched it behind his back, slapping on the cuffs with more force than was strictly necessary. "The only thing I regret is not finding you sooner. How many women have you destroyed with your operation, Malone? 10, 20, more?" Malone spat on the floor, but said nothing. It took another hour to secure all the prisoners and get them transported to the small jailhouse at the edge of town. Brooks made detailed notes of everything he found in Malone's office at the back of the saloon. Ledgers showing the fake debts assigned to women, correspondence with other saloon owners in different towns, even a list of names and prices that made his stomach turn. It was more than enough evidence to put Malone away for a very long time. By the time Brooks returned to Henderson's office, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. He was exhausted, his hands aching from the recoil of his guns and his ears still ringing from the gunshots in the enclosed space of the saloon. But he was alive, and Malone was in custody, and that was what mattered. He knocked softly on the door to Delilah's room, not wanting to wake her if she was sleeping, but her voice came almost immediately, tremulous with worry. "Who is it?" "Brooks," he said. "It is over. Malone is arrested." He heard movement inside, then the sound of the lock turning. The door opened, and Delilah stood there in a clean nightgown that Henderson must have provided, her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes wide with concern. "You are hurt," she said immediately, reaching toward his face. Brooks touched his cheek, and his fingers came away with blood. He had not even noticed the cut, probably from flying splinters during the gunfight. "It is nothing," he said, "just a scratch." But Delilah was already pulling him into the room, making him sit on the chair while she dampened a cloth at the washstand. She moved carefully, favoring her bandaged feet, but with determination. When she came back and began cleaning the cut on his face, her touch was gentle and careful. Brooks sat very still, acutely aware of her proximity, of the way her breath moved the tendrils of hair around her face, of the concentration in her eyes as she tended to him. No one had taken care of him in a long time. He had been on his own since he was 17, working dangerous jobs in dangerous places, and he had learned to patch himself up and keep moving. Having someone worry about him, care for him, was unexpectedly moving. "Thank you," he said quietly. Delilah's eyes met his, and he saw tears gathering there. "You could have been killed because of me." "Not because of you," Brooks said firmly, "because of Malone and men like him. That was my choice to make, and I would make it again." A tear spilled over and traced down her cheek. Brooks reached up without thinking and caught it with his thumb, his hand cupping her face. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing briefly, and something shifted between them in that moment, something profound and irrevocable. When her eyes opened again, they were searching his face with an intensity that matched what he felt. "I do not even know you," she whispered, "but I feel like I do. Is that foolish?" "If it is, then I am a fool too," Brooks said honestly, "because I have not been able to stop thinking about you since I walked into that saloon." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Delilah's hand came up to cover his where it still rested against her cheek. Her skin was soft and warm, and Brooks could feel her pulse fluttering like a trapped bird. "What happens now?" she asked, echoing her earlier question, but with a different meaning this time. Brooks knew what she was really asking. He knew that he should say something sensible, something about taking things slow or being practical or remembering that they had just met. But the words that came out of his mouth were the truth. "I do not know, but I would like to find out, if you would." Delilah smiled, a real smile that lit up her face and made her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with dancing or performance. "I would like that too." They stayed there for a long moment, the world narrowed down to just the two of them in the lamplight of the small room. Then Henderson's voice called from somewhere down the hall, breaking the spell, and they drew apart reluctantly. Brooks stood, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. "I should let you rest." You need to heal." "Will you come back?" Delilah asked, and there was vulnerability in her voice that made his chest ache. "Every day," he promised, "until you are well enough to walk out of here, and then after that too, if you will let me." Her smile widened. "I will let you." The next 2 weeks passed in a strange kind of suspended time that felt separate from the rest of the world. Brooks visited Delilah every day, sometimes multiple times a day when his duties allowed. He was still in Desdemona because he needed to prepare his case against Malone and coordinate with the federal prosecutors in Austin, which meant he had legitimate reasons to stay. But he knew that even if his job had called him elsewhere, he would have found excuses to remain. They talked for hours, learning each other's stories and histories. Delilah told him about growing up as the daughter of a ranch hand, moving from place to place as her father followed work. She told him about her mother who died when she was 8, about the books she loved to read when she could find them, about her dream of someday having a home of her own, a place that was permanent and safe. Brooks told her about his childhood in Austin, about a father who was a lawyer and a mother who was a teacher, both of whom died in a cholera outbreak when he was 16. He told her about working odd jobs for a year before joining the Texas Rangers at 17, about the things he had seen and done in the years since, about the way violence had become so familiar, he sometimes forgot what peace felt like. "Why did you become a federal marshal?" Delilah asked one afternoon. She was sitting up in bed with her feet propped on pillows, the bandages smaller now as Henderson gradually unwrapped them to reveal healing skin. Brooks was sitting in his usual chair, turned backwards so he could lean his arms on the back. "Because I got tired of operating in a small jurisdiction. As a ranger, I could only work in Texas. As a federal marshal, I can go after criminals who cross state lines, who think they can escape justice by running. It gives me more reach." "But it is more dangerous," Delilah pointed out. "Yes," he admitted, "but also more necessary. A lot of the worst criminals operate in the spaces between local laws, exploiting the gaps in jurisdiction. Someone has to close those gaps." Delilah studied him with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than he sometimes wanted to reveal. "You are a good man, Brooks Patterson." The simple statement made him uncomfortable in a way that gunfights and danger never did. "I am just a man doing a job." "No," she said firmly. "You are more than that. A man just doing a job would have reported Malone and moved on. You carried me out of there. You paid for my care. You visit me every day even though you have no obligation to. That is not just duty. That is goodness." Brooks did not know what to say to that. He had never thought of himself as particularly good, just determined to make some kind of difference in a world that often seemed bent toward cruelty. But the way Delilah looked at him made him want to be the man she saw, made him want to deserve her faith in him. As the days passed, Brooks found himself sharing things he had never told anyone. About the nightmares he sometimes had, reliving shootouts and chases gone wrong. About the weight of the lives he had taken, even when those lives belonged to men who would have killed him or hurt others. About the loneliness of his life, always moving from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to build real connections. Delilah listened to all of it without judgment, offering comfort and understanding that eased something in his chest he had not realized was tight. And she shared her own fears and pains. The helplessness she had felt watching her father die slowly, the shame of being trapped in Malone's system, the terror of dancing on ruined feet because the alternative was worse. They also talked about lighter things, books they had read, places they wanted to see, foods they loved. Delilah had a sharp sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh more than he had in years. Brooks discovered that she could do impressions of people that were uncannily accurate, and her rendition of Henderson's gruff bedside manner had him laughing until his sides hurt. On the 10th day, Henderson pronounced her feet healed enough to walk short distances with shoes that fit properly. Brooks took her to the general store and bought her new boots, soft leather ones that would not rub against the still tender scars. He also bought her 2 dresses, practical calico ones suitable for everyday wear, and a coat because the November nights were getting cold. Delilah protested the expense, but Brooks waved off her concerns. "Consider it back pay for the labor Malone stole from you," he said. Besides, I have money saved. Being a federal marshal pays reasonably well, and I do not spend much living out of saddlebags." They walked slowly back to Henderson's office, Delilah moving carefully in her new boots, but with increasing confidence. The sun was setting, painting Desdemona in shades of gold and amber, and the air smelled like wood smoke and coming winter. Brooks offered his arm, and Delilah took it, and they walked together through the quiet streets like any normal couple might. Except there was nothing normal about what Brooks was feeling. Every moment with Delilah felt significant, weighted with meaning he was only beginning to understand. He had thought he knew what attraction was, had certainly felt drawn to women before in his 30 years. But this was different. This was deeper and more complicated. A pull that was not just physical, but emotional and even spiritual. He was falling in love with her. He had probably been falling since the moment he saw her dancing with blood on the floor, and something in him had rebelled against the injustice of it. But now, after 2 weeks of daily conversations and shared vulnerabilities, there was no denying it. The question was whether she felt the same way. That evening, after Henderson had checked Delilah's feet one last time and pronounced her recovery progressing well, Brooks walked with her out to the small porch behind the doctor's office. It overlooked an empty lot where prairie grass grew tall, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. They stood side by side in comfortable silence for a while, and then Delilah said quietly, "I need to figure out what I'm going to do next. I cannot stay in Henderson's room forever, and I need to find work." Brooks had been thinking about this himself, worrying about it. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "I can cook and clean. I can read and write and do figures, so maybe clerking if someone will hire me. I just need something that will let me earn enough to support myself." She paused, then added with a wry smile, "Something that does not involve dancing." "You could come with me," Brooks said, the words coming out before he had fully thought them through. Delilah turned to look at him, her eyes wide. "What?" Brooks turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other 2 weeks. But I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, Delilah. When I am with you, I feel like I am home for the first time since my parents died, and I do not want to say goodbye to you." Delilah's breath caught, and he could see the tears gathering in her eyes again. "Brooks, I feel the same way, but what would I do? Follow you from town to town while you chase criminals? I would just be in the way." "No," he said firmly. "You would never be in the way. And I have been thinking about this. I have enough saved to buy some land, maybe build a house. I could take fewer field assignments, work more out of Austin doing investigative work and coordination. It would not be as exciting, but it would be safer, and it would let me have a real home with you." The tears spilled over now, tracking down her cheeks. "Are you asking me to marry you?" Brooks realized that he had been building toward it without quite admitting it to himself. "Yes," he said simply. "I am asking you to marry me. I am asking you to take a chance on a scarred-up lawman who has lived too rough and seen too much, but who will love you and protect you and give you the permanent home you have always wanted. I know it is fast, and I know you might need time to think about it, but I had to ask, because the thought of leaving Desdemona without you feels impossible." Delilah was crying openly now, but she was also smiling. She pulled one hand free and placed it against his chest, right over his heart. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you, Brooks Patterson, because you saved me in every way a person can be saved, and because when I think about my future, you are in every part of it." Brooks felt something in his chest crack open, some wall he had built years ago crumbling under the force of what he felt. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle at first and then deeper as she responded, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck. She tasted like hope and new beginnings. And Brooks knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Delilah laughed through her tears. "We are insane. People are going to think we have lost our minds." "Let them," Brooks said, grinning wider than he had in years. "I do not care what anyone thinks except you." They stood there on the porch holding each other as the stars came out one by one overhead, and Brooks sent up a silent prayer of thanks to whatever force had led him to Desdemona at exactly the right moment to save exactly the right woman. The next morning, Brooks went to see Reverend Matthews, who ran the small church at the edge of town. The Reverend was a kindly, older man who had been in Desdemona for 30 years and had married, baptized, and buried most of its residents. "I want to get married," Brooks told him without preamble, "as soon as possible." Reverend Matthews raised his eyebrows. "Well, now that is wonderful news. Who is the lucky lady?" "Delilah Sterling. She was working at the Silver Spur until I arrested Malone." Understanding dawned in the Reverend's eyes. "Ah, I heard about what you did there. Heard you carried that poor girl out when she could barely stand. Good for you, son. She is welcome in my church any time, and I would be honored to perform the ceremony." They discussed timing and logistics. Brooks wanted to marry quickly, both because he felt the urgency of his feelings and because he would need to travel back to Austin soon to testify at Malone's trial. Reverend Matthews agreed to perform the ceremony in 3 days, which would give Brooks time to make arrangements and give Delilah time to prepare. Brooks's next stop was the land office. He had been looking into available properties around Desdemona during his time there, and he had his eye on a plot about 5 miles outside of town. It was 40 acres with a stream running through it. Good grazing land and enough timber to build a house. The price was reasonable, and Brooks paid it in full with money he had been saving for years without quite knowing what he was saving for. Now he knew. He was saving for a life with Delilah. He spent the next 2 days in a whirlwind of activity. He hired a local carpenter to start work on a simple house, just 2 rooms to start with, but built solid and expandable. He bought furniture from the general store, a bed, a table, chairs, a stove. He arranged for supplies to be delivered to the property. He worked from dawn until after dark, driven by a need to give Delilah something tangible, something that said she would never have to worry about having a home again. Delilah, for her part, spent those days with the help of several local women who had heard about the upcoming wedding and wanted to assist. They helped her make a dress from white cotton fabric, simple but pretty with lace at the collar and cuffs. They baked cakes and pies for the reception. They decorated the church with whatever late-season flowers they could find. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, with a sky so blue it looked painted. Brooks stood at the front of the church in his best clothes, which were still just clean work clothes, and his marshal's coat, and watched Delilah walk down the aisle toward him. She was beautiful, not in the painted, performing way she had been at the saloon, but in a way that was real and unadorned and absolutely stunning. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid with flowers woven through it, and her face was glowing with happiness. She walked steadily in her new boots, her feet fully healed now, and her eyes never left his. When she reached him and took his hands, Brooks felt his throat tighten with emotion. Reverend Matthews began the ceremony, his voice warm and steady, and Brooks barely heard the words. He was too focused on Delilah, on the way her hands trembled slightly in his, on the tears of joy in her eyes, on the smile that seemed to light her up from within. When it came time for vows, Brooks spoke from the heart. "Delilah, I promise to love you and protect you for all the days of my life. I promise to give you a home where you are safe and cherished. I promise to be worthy of the trust you are placing in me. I promise to face whatever comes with you by my side and to never let you dance alone again." His last words made her laugh even as she cried, and she squeezed his hands tightly. Then it was her turn. "Brooks, I promise to love you with everything I have. I promise to stand with you through whatever dangers or challenges come. I promise to build a life with you that is full of joy and hope. You saved me when I had given up on being saved, and I promise to spend the rest of my life showing you what that means to me." Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, and Brooks kissed his bride there in the small church while the assembled townspeople cheered. It was not a large gathering, mostly people who barely knew them, but their joy was genuine and their support real. The reception was held in the churchyard with tables set up under the trees and food enough to feed twice as many people. Brooks and Delilah ate and danced, a slow, gentle dance that was nothing like the torture of the saloon, and accepted congratulations from well-wishers. Sheriff Colton came by to shake Brooks's hand. "You are a good man, Patterson. Desdemona is grateful for what you did with Malone, and I'm glad you found someone to share your life with. You deserve it." Henderson gave Delilah a gruff hug and told her she was welcome to come back any time if her feet gave her trouble. "But something tells me you will be just fine now," he added with a smile. As the sun began to set, Brooks and Delilah slipped away from the celebration. Brooks had borrowed a wagon and 2 horses, and they rode out to the property he had bought. The house was not finished yet, still just a frame and partial walls, but the carpenter had completed one room enough to be livable, with a roof and a door, and windows that closed. Brooks carried Delilah over the threshold, a tradition he had heard of but never participated in, and set her down gently in the middle of the room. It was sparse, just the bed and a small table with a lamp, but it was theirs. "Welcome home," Brooks said softly. Delilah looked around with wonder, then threw her arms around his neck. "It is perfect. You are perfect. I cannot believe this is real." "It is real," Brooks promised, holding her close. "This is our beginning, Delilah Patterson. Everything that happened before led to this moment, and everything after starts now." They stayed up late into the night, talking and holding each other, making plans for the future, and simply enjoying being together. When they finally lay down in their bed in their house on their land, Brooks felt a peace settle over him that he had not experienced in years. He had spent so long moving from place to place, chasing criminals and danger, that he had forgotten what it felt like to have something worth protecting. But now, with Delilah asleep in his arms, her breathing soft and even, he understood this was what he had been searching for without knowing it. Not just a woman, but a home. Not just love, but belonging. Love. The next few months passed in a blur of building and settling. Brooks continued his work as a federal marshal, but he took fewer field assignments and spent more time working on cases from Desdemona. He coordinated with other marshals, compiled evidence, and made trips to Austin when necessary, but he always came home to Delilah. The house grew slowly but steadily. By Christmas, they had 2 full rooms and a kitchen area. By spring, they had added a porch and started work on a barn. Brooks discovered that he enjoyed physical labor, the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. It was different from the work of law enforcement, less dangerous, but no less meaningful. Delilah transformed the house into a home. She planted a garden and learned to cook on the wood stove. She sewed curtains for the windows and made quilts for the bed. She filled shelves with books she bought or borrowed, creating the library she had always dreamed of. But more than that, she filled the house with warmth and laughter. She sang while she worked, her voice sweet and clear, and Brooks would sometimes stop whatever he was doing just to listen. She told stories at night, making up elaborate tales that had him hanging on every word. She showed him how to dance properly, not the forced performance of the saloon, but real dancing, the kind that was about 2 people moving together in joy. They also faced challenges. Malone's trial in Austin required Brooks to testify for several days, and it was the first time since their marriage that they were apart for more than a night. Delilah hated being without him, worrying constantly that something would happen, and Brooks found the separation almost unbearable. But they wrote letters every day, and when Brooks finally returned, their reunion was all the sweeter for the time apart. The trial ended with Malone being sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, along with several of his associates. The women he had trapped were all freed from their false debts, and Brooks helped several of them find legitimate work or transportation to other towns where they had family. It was satisfying in a way that few of his cases had been, knowing that he had made a real difference in multiple lives. Summer brought heat and hard work as they expanded their property, adding cattle and chickens and a vegetable garden large enough to feed them and sell surplus in town. Brooks hired a couple of local men to help with the heavy work, and Delilah befriended their wives, forming the kind of community connection she had never had growing up. It was in late August, nearly a year after their wedding, that Delilah told Brooks she was pregnant. They were sitting on the porch after dinner watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple when she took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "There is someone else living here now," she said softly. "Someone who's going to need a bigger house and a lot of love." Brooks stared at her, his mind taking a moment to process what she was saying. Then understanding dawned, and with it a wave of emotion so powerful it took his breath away. "You are pregnant," he said, his voice rough with feeling. Delilah nodded, her eyes shining with tears and joy. "We are going to have a baby, Brooks. You are going to be a father." Brooks pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully, as though she might break. His own eyes were wet, and he did not care. "I love you," he said fiercely. "I love you so much, Delilah, and I promise I'm going to be a good father. I am going to give our child everything I did not have: safety, stability, a home that never changes." "I know you will," Delilah said, her arms tight around him. "You are the best man I've ever known, Brooks Patterson. Our child is so lucky to have you as a father." They sat there as the stars came out, talking about names and plans and dreams for their growing family. Brooks's mind was already racing ahead, thinking about expanding the house further, about taking even fewer dangerous assignments, about all the ways his life was going to change. But underneath all the practical considerations was a deep, abiding joy. He was going to be a father. He and Delilah were going to bring a new life into the world, a child who would grow up surrounded by love and safety. It felt like the culmination of everything they had built together, the ultimate expression of their love. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Delilah had some morning sickness in the early months, but overall she was healthy and strong. Brooks fussed over her constantly, which she tolerated with patient amusement. He insisted she not lift anything heavy, that she rest frequently, that she eat the most nutritious foods. Delilah teased him about being overprotective, but secretly she loved his care and concern. As winter approached and Delilah's due date drew closer, Brooks made the difficult decision to officially resign from field work as a federal marshal. He kept his badge and his status, which allowed him to work on cases from home doing research and coordination. But he would no longer be traveling for assignments or putting himself in danger. "My place is here now," he told his supervisor in Austin during his final official visit. "I have a wife and a child on the way, and they need me more than the badge does." His supervisor, a grizzled veteran named Captain Morgan, nodded with understanding. "You have done good work, Patterson. More than good. You have saved lives and brought justice to places that had none. But you are right that it is time to step back. Go home to your family. Be the husband and father they need. That is important work too." Brooks rode back to Desdemona with a sense of finality, but also of rightness. He was closing one chapter of his life and beginning another, and he was at peace with the decision. Delilah gave birth on a cold February night in 1884, with Henderson attending, along with a midwife named Mrs. Carson, who had delivered half the babies in Desdemona. It was a long labor, nearly 12 hours, and Brooks paced outside the bedroom door wearing a path in the floorboards, while inside Delilah worked through the pain and effort of bringing their child into the world. When he finally heard the sharp, indignant cry of a newborn, Brooks felt his knees go weak with relief. Mrs. Carson opened the door a few minutes later, smiling broadly. "You have a son, Marshall Patterson, a healthy baby boy with a fine set of lungs." Brooks went inside to find Delilah exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, and Brooks crossed the room in 2 strides to kneel beside the bed. "Look at him," Delilah whispered, pulling back the blanket to reveal a small red face with eyes squeezed shut and fists waving angrily. "Look at our son." Brooks touched one tiny hand and watched in wonder as miniature fingers curled around his own much larger finger with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Brooks said, his voice choked with emotion. "You are perfect. Thank you, Delilah. Thank you for him, for everything." They named the baby Benjamin, after Brooks's father, with the middle name Sterling to honor Delilah's family. Little Benjamin Patterson was indeed healthy and strong, and he grew quickly under his parents' devoted care. Brooks discovered that fatherhood was simultaneously the most terrifying and most rewarding thing he had ever done. Every cry in the night sent him rushing to the cradle. Every cough or sneeze filled him with worry. But watching Benjamin learn and grow, seeing Delilah with their son, feeling the weight of the baby sleeping on his chest, these moments filled him with a contentment deeper than anything he had known. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard winters when money was tight and they had to carefully manage their resources. There were illnesses, including a particularly bad fever when Benjamin was 2 that had them both terrified until it finally broke. There were disagreements and frustrations, the normal friction of 2 people building a life together. But through it all, the love between Brooks and Delilah only deepened. They were partners in every sense, working together to build their ranch, raise their son, and create the kind of home they had both longed for. They still danced on the porch on summer evenings, still talked for hours about everything and nothing, still looked at each other with the same intensity they had felt that first night when he carried her out of the Silver Spur. When Benjamin was 3, Delilah became pregnant again. This time it was twins, a boy and a girl, born in the spring of 1887. They named them Daniel and Emma, and the house that had seemed spacious suddenly felt very full. Brooks added more rooms, and Delilah managed the chaos of 3 small children with grace and humor. Brooks continued his work helping other marshals from home, providing expertise and research support for cases across the region. It was satisfying work that let him contribute to justice without putting his family at risk. He also served as an informal advisor to Sheriff Colton, helping with difficult cases and training young deputies in proper procedures. The ranch prospered. They acquired more land and livestock, building a successful cattle operation that provided a stable income. Brooks hired reliable ranch hands, including one young man who reminded him of himself at that age and took satisfaction in teaching and mentoring. But the greatest satisfaction was always in coming home at the end of each day to find Delilah waiting, to gather his children in his arms, to sit down to dinner at the table he had built in the house they had made together. These simple domestic moments were what mattered most, the proof that he had succeeded in giving Delilah the permanent home she had always dreamed of. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Brooks took Delilah back to the church where they had been married. The children were staying with Henderson, who had become something like a grandfather to them, and it was just the 2 of them for a rare evening alone. They walked through the quiet church, remembering that day a decade earlier when they had stood at the altar and promised to love each other forever. Then they went out to the churchyard and danced under the stars, just the 2 of them, with no music except the rhythm of their hearts beating in time. "Do you ever regret it?" Brooks asked quietly as they swayed together. "Marrying me so quickly? Giving up the freedom to choose your own path?" Delilah pulled back to look at him, her eyes fierce. "Not for one single second. You gave me freedom, Brooks. You gave me choices I never would have had otherwise. Everything good in my life comes from you walking into that saloon 10 years ago and refusing to let me be destroyed. Everything good in my life comes from you letting me carry you out," Brooks countered. "You made me want to be better, to do better. You gave me a reason to build instead of just chase. You gave me a home." "We gave each other a home," Delilah said softly. "That is what love does. It creates a place where 2 people belong together." They kissed there under the stars, with 10 years of shared history behind them and a lifetime still ahead. When they finally pulled apart, Brooks rested his forehead against hers and said, "I love you, Delilah Patterson. I will love you until the day I die and beyond if the universe allows it." "I love you too," she whispered back. "My cowboy, my hero, my home." The years continued to pass, bringing more joys and challenges. The children grew up strong and loved, with Benjamin showing an interest in ranching, Daniel drawn to books and learning, and Emma determined to be a teacher like Brooks's mother had been. They added more children to the family, 2 more sons and another daughter, filling the house with noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of a large family. Brooks's hair went gray at the temples, and Delilah developed laugh lines around her eyes from years of smiling, but they still looked at each other the way they had when they first met, with love and desire and deep friendship. They still danced on the porch. They still talked late into the night. They still reached for each other first thing in the morning and last thing before sleep. On a warm evening in the spring of 1907, when they had been married for 25 years, Brooks and Delilah sat on their porch watching the sunset. The house behind them was larger now, expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family. The land stretched out in all directions, productive and well-tended. In the distance, they could see some of their grandchildren playing near the barn, the next generation growing up on the land their grandparents had built. "Do you remember the night we met?" Delilah asked, her hand in Brooks's as it had been for a quarter century. "Every detail," Brooks said. "The smoke in the air, the blood on the floor, the way you kept dancing even though you were dying on your feet. The way you looked at me when I picked you up, like you could not quite believe I was real." "I could not," Delilah admitted. "You appeared like something out of a story, this strong, good man who refused to let injustice stand. You saved my life that night, Brooks." "And you saved mine," Brooks replied. "I was so lost before I met you, just drifting from one case to the next with no purpose beyond the badge. You gave me something to build toward, something worth protecting. You gave me everything that matters." Delilah leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in colors that never got old, no matter how many sunsets they watched together. Around them was the evidence of a life well lived, the house they had built, the land they had tended, the family they had raised, but more than any of that was the love they had nurtured, the partnership they had forged, the home they had created together. "We did good, did we not?" Delilah said softly. "We did very good," Brooks agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We built something real and lasting. We raised children who know what love looks like. We created a legacy that will outlive us both." "No regrets?" she asked, echoing his question from years earlier. "Not one," Brooks said firmly, "except maybe that I did not find you sooner." Delilah laughed, that same bright laugh he had first heard in Henderson's office all those years ago when she was healing from her ordeal. But then we would not have appreciated it as much. We needed to go through what we went through to understand how precious this is. Brooks thought about that, about the hard years before they met, about the pain and loneliness and violence that had shaped him, about Delilah's suffering and desperation, about the night she danced until her feet bled because she saw no other choice. It had all been terrible, but it had also been necessary somehow, the dark prelude that made their light together shine all the brighter. "You are right," he said. "Every hard thing led us here. And I would walk through fire if it meant ending up with you." "You did walk through fire," Delilah pointed out. "You walked into a saloon full of dangerous men and carried me out. That was the moment everything changed." "For both of us," Brooks said, "that was the moment I started living instead of just existing." They sat together as the stars came out one by one overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, every major moment of their lives together. The grandchildren were called inside by their parents, and lights began to glow in windows across their property. Somewhere a horse whinnied, and the breeze carried the scent of honeysuckle and fresh grass. This was home. This was love. This was the life they had built from nothing but determination and devotion and a chance meeting on the worst and best night of their lives. Years later, when Brooks was an old man with white hair and hands that trembled slightly with age, he would still remember that night in 1882 when he walked into the Silver Spur Saloon and saw a woman dancing on bleeding feet. He would remember the way his heart had clenched with fury and compassion, the way his decision to intervene had felt less like a choice and more like destiny. He would remember carrying her out into the night air, her weight in his arms both fragile and precious, and knowing somehow that his life would never be the same. And he would be grateful every single day for that knowledge, for that moment, for the woman who had been forced to dance until her feet bled and the cowboy who put a stop to it and carried her out. Because from that terrible night had come everything beautiful in his life. Love, family, home, purpose, belonging. Delilah would sit beside him in their later years, her hair white but her eyes still bright with love, and they would hold hands the way they always had. They would watch their children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren run and play on the land they had built together. They would tell stories of the old days, of how they met and fell in love in just 2 weeks, of building a house and a life from nothing. And when people said their story sounded too perfect, too much like a fairy tale to be real, they would just smile and exchange glances that held decades of shared history. Because they knew the truth, that the best love stories were the ones built not on perfection, but on choosing each other every single day, on facing challenges together and supporting each other through hard times, on creating something lasting out of nothing but hope and determination and deep, abiding love. On a summer evening when they were both very old and death was creeping closer, Brooks and Delilah sat on their porch one last time. Their children and grandchildren had gathered for a family reunion, and the property was full of people who existed because 2 desperate souls had found each other in a saloon in Desdemona, Texas, in the year 1882. "Do you remember what I said to you the night we met?" Brooks asked Delilah, his voice thin with age but still warm with love. "You said a lot of things that night," Delilah replied, her hand tightening on his. "I said I would never let you dance alone again," Brooks said. "And I kept that promise. Every day of our lives we have danced together." Delilah turned to look at him, tears gathering in her eyes. "You did keep that promise. You have never let me be alone, not for one moment. You have been my partner in everything." "As you have been mine," Brooks said. "Everything I am, everything good I have done, it all comes back to you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Delilah Sterling Patterson." "And you are the best thing that ever happened to me," she whispered back. "My cowboy who saved me. My husband who loved me. My home." They kissed there on the porch where they had kissed 1,000 times before, surrounded by the evidence of a life magnificently lived. And as the sun set on that summer evening, painting the Texas sky in colors of gold and crimson, Brooks and Delilah held each other and knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, just as they always had, just as they always would. Their story had begun with violence and pain, with a woman forced to dance until her feet bled and a cowboy who put a stop to it and carried her out. But it had grown into something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of love to transform and redeem. It had become a legacy that would live on in their children and grandchildren, in the land they had tended, in the memories of everyone whose lives they had touched. And when the end finally came for them both, peaceful and in their sleep within days of each other after 60 years of marriage, their family laid them to rest side by side on a hill overlooking the land they had loved. The graves were marked with simple stones that bore their names and the years of their lives, but the real monument to their love was everywhere, in the ranch that still operated, in the descendants who carried on their values, in the story that would be told for generations about how they met and fell in love. The story of a woman who had been forced to dance until her feet bled, and the cowboy who put a stop to it and carried her out. The story of how that terrible night became the beginning of something beautiful. The story of how love can bloom in the darkest places and grow into something strong enough to last a lifetime. It was a love story for the ages, set in the Wild West where life was hard and justice was rough, but true love, when it came, was worth everything. And though Brooks and Delilah were gone, their love remained, woven into the very fabric of the land they had built their life on, enduring and eternal. Their great-grandchildren would play on that land, running through the same fields where Brooks and Delilah had walked together. They would hear the stories of how their ancestors met, of the courage and compassion that had brought them together. And they would understand that the best legacies are not made of money or possessions, but of love freely given and faithfully kept. The house still stood, expanded and modified over the years, but still containing the original room where Brooks had carried Delilah over the threshold on their wedding night. Families of descendants took turns living there, maintaining it, honoring the memory of the couple who had built it. And on summer evenings, if you stood on the porch and listened carefully, you could almost hear the echo of music and laughter, of two people dancing together in joy and love. The Silver Spur Saloon was long gone, torn down years earlier after Malone's arrest had exposed the depths of his criminal operation. In its place stood a school, which seemed appropriate somehow, a place of learning and growth rising from the ashes of exploitation and pain. And in that school, the teachers sometimes told the story of Delilah Sterling, who had worked in the old saloon and nearly died there, before being saved by a brave federal marshal named Brooks Patterson. The story was always told as a reminder that one person's courage could change everything, that standing up against injustice mattered, that love was worth fighting for. And the children who heard it would carry it forward, passing it down through generations, keeping alive the memory of a woman who danced until her feet bled, and the cowboy who put a stop to it and carried her out. Because some stories deserve to be remembered, some love deserves to be celebrated, and some lives lived fully and faithfully together deserve to become legend. Brooks and Delilah's love was such a legend. It had begun in darkness and bloomed in light. It had weathered every storm and celebrated every joy. It had created life and legacy and lasting impact. And though they were gone, the love remained eternal and unbreakable, a testament to what two people could build when they chose each other and never let go. Their story was complete, every thread woven together, every promise kept, every dream fulfilled. They had lived and loved and built something beautiful. They had raised a family and created a home and touched countless lives. They had shown that even in the rough and violent world of the Wild West, where life was hard and death came easily, love could not only survive but thrive. And in the end, that was everything. That was the whole story. That was the legacy of the woman forced to dance until her feet bled, and the cowboy who put a stop to it and carried her out, who fell in love and built a life and lived happily ever after in the truest and best sense of those words. Their love had been real. Their commitment had been absolute. Their life together had been everything either of them had ever wanted and more than they had dared to dream. And now their story was told, complete and finished, with every question answered and every ending tied up neatly. They had lived, they had loved, they had triumphed, and they had found their happily ever after in the arms of each other, which was the only place it could have been found. The end had come, as all ends must, but it was a good end, a satisfying end, a closed end that left nothing unresolved. Brooks and Delilah had run their race and finished well. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried on, living on the land and in the home their ancestors had built, keeping alive the memory and the love that had started it all. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go after this life, Brooks and Delilah were together still, dancing under eternal stars, their love undiminished and unending, forever entwined as they had been from that fateful night in Desdemona when everything changed. Their story was finished. Their love was eternal. Their legacy would endure for generations. And the memory of what they had built together, the life they had created from nothing but determination and devotion, would inspire others to believe that true love was possible, that happy endings were real, and that sometimes, against all odds, two broken people could find each other and become whole.